Welcome to our deep dive today. We're going to be taking a look at something called iterative learning. Ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah. It's a game changer.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so the whole thing is through this idea of learnography.
That's right. It's a whole new way of thinking about how our brains learn best.
So it's like brain-based learning.
Exactly.
Interesting. All right, so we're going to be looking at an article from the Taxshila Page blog. It's called Iterative Learning, Brainpage Engine of Knowledge Transfer in Learnography, and just came out March 7th, 2025, today.
Hot off the presses.
Okay, so this is for anyone really who wants to learn better, like at work, new hobbies, or just because.
If you have a brain, this deep dive is for you.
All right, so we're going to be talking about how repetition is actually good.
Yeah.
And not the boring kind either.
No more rote memorization.
Cool.
Yeah.
And also why doing stuff, physical stuff like drawing or building can help you learn.
It's all about engaging your brain and body.
And get this, mistakes are good.
Mistakes are opportunities in disguise.
I like that. I make a lot of them. So yeah, let's jump right in.
Let's do it.
One of the things that struck me about this article is how it kind of pushes back against those old school learning methods. Like sitting in a lecture being talked at for hours on end.
Yeah, the sage on the stage approach.
Yeah.
Not very effective.
No. For me, I'm a hands-on learner. I have to actually do something to really get it.
You and me both. That's why learnography is so powerful. It emphasizes active learning, actually using the knowledge you're taking in.
Okay, so active learning versus passive learning. Got it. And the key to this active learning thing is iterative learning.
You got it.
So at first glance, it seems like, okay, you just do something over and over again. But I'm guessing it's a bit more nuanced than that, right?
You're right. It's not just mindless repetition. There's a purpose behind each iteration. You practice, you get feedback, you make adjustments, and then you practice again. It's a cycle of continuous improvement.
Okay, I see. So it's imagine learning to play the piano. You wouldn't just keep hitting the wrong notes over and over. You'd listen to how it sounds, identify the parts you need to work on, and then adjust your technique.
Exactly. That's iterative learning in action. You're constantly refining your approach based on the feedback you receive.
So where do brain pages fit into all of this? The article mentions them as being really important for this whole process.
Think of brain pages like mental blueprints for a skill or concept. Every time you go through that iterative learning cycle, you're basically adding details and refining those blueprints in your brain.
Okay, so the more you practice and refine, the more detailed and accurate those brain pages become.
Exactly. And there are three key elements to developing these brain pages. The first one is encoding the knowledge.
Encoding. So it's not just about memorizing facts and figures.
Nope. It's about understanding the context, the why behind the information, going beyond surface level understanding to really grasp the underlying principles.
So it's not just knowing that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, but understanding why that happens at a molecular level.
You got it. That deeper understanding is what makes the knowledge stick. And that's where the second element comes in. Motor practice.
Okay, so motor practice. This is where it gets really interesting for me. I've always been someone who learns best by doing. I have to write things down, build things, move around, sitting still and just listening. Forget about it.
That's because you're intuitively tapping into the power of motor practice. When you physically engage with the material, you're activating different parts of your brain and forging those neural connections.
So I'm not just fidgeting, I'm actually boosting my learning.
You got it.
Yeah.
You're turning those abstract concepts into concrete experiences.
I love it. But what about feedback? Is it just about knowing whether you got something right or wrong?
Feedback is crucial in iterative learning because it helps you pinpoint those areas where your brain page needs a little bit of revising. It could come from an instructor, a peer, or even yourself through self-reflection.
Right, so it's not about beating yourself up over mistakes. It's about using those mistakes as information, as a guide for improvement.
Exactly. Think of mistakes as signposts pointing you in the right direction.
I love that. So instead of getting discouraged when I mess up, I should see it as an opportunity to figure out what I need to work on. That's a pretty powerful shift in perspective.
It really is. And this approach actually aligns perfectly with how our brains are wired. Have you ever heard of neuroplasticity?
Yeah. It's the idea that our brains are constantly changing and adapting based on what we do and experience, right?
Exactly. So every time you engage in that cycle of practice, feedback, and refinement, you're strengthening specific neural pathways in your brain. You're literally rewiring yourself to become more efficient at whatever you're learning.
Whoa. So I'm not just learning a new skill, I'm actually changing my brain. That's pretty mind-blowing. But it does make me wonder, If our brains are so adaptable, why do traditional education methods often feel so, well, ineffective?
That's a great question, and it's one that the Learnography approach seeks to address. It recognizes that everyone's brain is unique and we all learn differently.
So rather than a one-size-fits-all approach,
Right.
Learnography is more about finding the methods that work best for each individual.
You got it. It's about personalizing the learning journey. And that's what we'll be digging into in the next part of our deep dive. So yeah, picking up where we left off, it seems like Learnography really tries to move away from that one-size-fits-all model that a lot of us had to deal with in school, you know?
Yeah, it's so refreshing to hear about a learning approach that recognizes that we're all different. We all have our own unique ways of learning.
Exactly. Some people are visual learners, some are auditory, some learn best by doing. And Learnography acknowledges that and encourages people to find what works best for them.
It's like giving learners permission to create their own learning journey, right? Instead of forcing everyone down the same path.
Precisely. Instead of a rigid curriculum, it's more about letting people explore their interests, the things that genuinely spark their curiosity.
I can already see how that would make learning so much more engaging. Like instead of feeling like you're being force-fed information, it's like you're on a treasure hunt, discovering knowledge that you actually care about.
And that intrinsic motivation is key, right? When you're genuinely interested in what you're learning, your brain is much more receptive to it.
So how does Learnography actually put this into practice? Are there specific techniques or methods they use to make this happen?
Yeah, the article talks about a few things. One that stood out to me was this concept of miniature schools.
Miniature schools, that sounds kind of cute, but I'm guessing it's more than just tiny desks and a little playground, right?
You're right, it's not about physical size, it's about creating these smaller, more intimate learning environments within a larger setting.
So instead of those huge lecture halls packed with hundreds of students, it's more like small study groups or workshops.
Exactly. It allows for much more personalized attention from the instructors, who basically act as mentors guiding students through their learning process.
It makes me think of that old apprenticeship model, like where you would learn a trade by working side by side with an experienced master. That seems like such a more effective way to really learn something deeply.
Absolutely. And in these miniature schools, students also benefit from learning from each other, collaborating, and providing each other with feedback. It creates this really supportive and engaging learning environment.
And speaking of feedback, this ties back to what we were talking about before, right? Feedback is crucial in that iterative learning cycle.
Exactly. And in a miniature school setting, there's much more opportunity for personalized feedback, both from the instructor and from your peers.
It's like having a built-in support system to help you through those inevitable bumps in the road of learning. But we've been throwing around this term Brainpage a lot. I'm still a little fuzzy on what exactly that is and how it's formed.
Sure, so think of a brain cage as a mental model of a specific concept or skill. It's how your brain organizes and stores information. Imagine you're building a house. The brain page is like the blueprint that guides the construction process.
So the more detailed and well-structured that blueprint is, the stronger and more functional the house will be.
Exactly. And just like a blueprint needs to be revised and refined during the building process, our brain pages also evolve as we learn. Every time we go through that cycle of iterative learning, practicing, getting feedback, refining, we're adding more detail and complexity to those mental blueprints.
So it's not just about cramming our brains full of facts, but about creating this coherent framework of understanding that we can build upon.
You got it. And the article talks about a specific technique called thalamic cyclizide rehearsal, or TCR, that helps strengthen these brain pages.
TCR, okay. That sounds a little intimidating.
It might sound complex, but it's a pretty intuitive concept. It's based on the idea of spaced repetition.
Oh, space repetition. Yeah, I've used that before. I'm a big fan of flashcards.
Right, so you're already familiar with the basic principle. With TCR, you basically revisit and refine your knowledge at specific intervals, gradually increasing the time through each review.
So instead of cramming everything in at once, I spread it out over time. It's like give my brain a chance to breathe and absorb the information.
Exactly. And it's incredibly effective. It's like strengthening a muscle. Each time you revisit the material, you're giving your brain a little workout, which helps solidify those neural connections.
Okay, that makes sense. So if I'm trying to learn a new language, for example, instead of spending hours trying to memorize vocabulary lists all at once, I would be better off reviewing a few words each day and gradually increasing the time between those reviews.
That's a great example. And this spaced repetition technique, or TCR, is a core part of the one day, one book method that Learnography advocates for.
Oh yeah, one day, one book. I've heard of that. It's basically about immersing yourself in a single book or topic for a whole day, right?
Right. It's about going deep, allowing for those multiple cycles of iterative learning within a compressed time frame.
It's like a full day workshop for your brain. It sounds pretty intense, but also super effective.
It can be demanding, but it really allows your brain to fully engage with the material, to make connections, and to really build those robust brain pages we've been talking about.
Okay, so this is all making much more sense now. But I am curious about one thing. We've talked a lot about brain pages, but the article also mentions something called Zide pages. What are those?
Ah, that's a great question. And it gets to the heart of what we do with all this knowledge we're building up.
So it's not just about taking in information and forming those brain pages, but about actually using that knowledge, right? Putting it into practice.
You got it. And that's where the Zeit pages come in. Think of them as the tangible expressions of what you've learned.
Okay, I need a real-world example here. What would a Zide page look like?
Let's say you're learning to code, for example. Your brain page would be that mental model you've built of the coding concepts and syntax. Your Zeit page would be the actual website or app that you create using that knowledge.
Ah, I see. So it's the proof that you haven't just memorized the information, but you've actually internalized it and can apply it in a practical way.
Exactly. Learnography encourages people to create their own Zeit pages through various activities like projects, presentations, experiments, or even teaching others.
That's a really cool way to think about it. It's like closing the loop on the learning cycle. You take what you've learned and you turn it into something real, something meaningful. But how do we know if our Zeit pages are effective? How do we actually measure our progress in this whole learnography thing?
That's another great question, and it takes us to an interesting part of the learnography approach, this idea of a source page.
Source page. Okay, you're really expanding my learnography vocabulary today. What's a source page?
Think of the source page as the starting point of your learning journey. It's that raw material, the information or skill you want to learn.
So it could be anything from a textbook to a YouTube tutorial to even like a hands-on workshop.
Exactly. And Learnography encourages learners to be really proactive in seeking out source pages that match their interests and their learning styles.
So it's not about passively receiving information from a teacher, but about actively pursuing knowledge that will help you build those brain pages and create those Zeit pages.
You're getting it. And that active approach is crucial for developing a lifelong love of learning.
This is all really starting to click for me now. It was like this dynamic learning ecosystem, the source page, the brain page, and the Zeit page, they're all interconnected. But I am curious to hear more about the practical benefits of all this. What can our listeners really expect to gain from embracing this learnography approach?
That's a great question to wrap up this part of our deep dive. All right, so we're going to wrap up our deep dive into learnography by talking about the benefits, like what's in it for the listener.
Yeah, exactly. We've been throwing around all these ideas and concepts, but
Yeah.
How does this actually translate into real-world results,
That's the million-dollar question. Well, maybe not literally, but you know what I mean.
Right. So what can people actually expect to get out of all this?
One of the biggest benefits is deep mastery.
Deep mastery.
It's about going beyond just knowing facts, to really understanding the why and how behind them.
So it's not just memorizing a recipe, but understanding the science of cooking.
Yeah, exactly. Which makes you a way better cook, by the way. More creative, more adaptable.
So you can experiment, try new things, not be afraid to deviate from the recipe.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because you understand the underlying principles.
I like that. So it's about building a solid foundation.
Exactly.
Foundation that you can use to solve problems and think critically.
And apply what you've learned to new situations.
It's like that saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime.
I love that analogy. It's about empowering people to become self-directed, lifelong learners.
And that's where resilience comes in.
Absolutely.
We talk about how iterative learning encourages people to view mistakes as opportunities.
Yeah, as valuable feedback.
And that can be huge for so many learners, right?
I mean, think about it. In a traditional learning environment, making a mistake can be so discouraging. You feel like you've failed.
And that can really kill your motivation, right?
Totally. But when you approach learning iteratively, those mistakes become part of the process.
They're not setbacks.
They're stepping stones.
They're like guideposts. pointing you in the right direction.
Exactly. And the more you embrace that mindset, the more resilient you become. You're not afraid to experiment, try new things, even if you might mess up along the way.
It's like learning to ride a bike.
Exactly. You're going to fall a few times.
But each time you get back up.
You learn something, you adjust your approach, and eventually you find your balance.
And then you're off, riding down the street, feeling the wind in your hair.
And that sense of accomplishment.
It's so powerful.
It builds confidence. And it fosters a growth mindset.
This idea that you can always improve.
No matter what. No matter how many times you fall.
And that's so crucial in today's world.
Right.
Everything's changing so fast.
You have to be able to adapt, learn new things quickly, be comfortable with uncertainty.
Learnography kind of gives you that, right?
The tools and the mindset.
To navigate this complex world.
Exactly. But does it take a certain kind of person to really benefit from all this? I mean, is it just for those who are already naturally curious and self-motivated?
That's a good question.
I think the beauty of Learnography is that it can work for anyone. It's not about personality type.
It's about mindset.
A willingness to experiment, to embrace feedback.
To keep getting better no matter where you're starting from.
Right. And the more you engage with this approach, the more those qualities become part of who you are.
It's like a positive feedback loop.
Exactly. As you experience the joy of learning, the satisfaction of mastering new skills.
It makes you want to learn even more.
And grow even more.
Wow, this has been such an inspiring conversation.
I agree.
We've learned so much about the science and methods of learnography.
And the mindset.
And it's clear that this approach has the potential to revolutionize how we learn, not just in school, but in all areas of life.
That's the hope.
So for anyone listening who's intrigued by all this, you can learn more at the Taxshila Page blog.
Yeah, they have a ton of great resources there.
And remember, learning is not a destination.
It's a journey.
Embrace the process.
Celebrate the mistakes.
And never stop exploring.
That's the key.
On that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another exploration of fascinating ideas and groundbreaking concepts. Until then, happy learning, everyone.